twice within 6 years, New Orleans turned to ash. The first fire came on Good Friday, 1788. A candle left near an altar caught the wind. Within hours, more than 800 buildings were gone. In 1794, before the city had finished rebuilding, fire swept through again, finishing what the first had started, leaving the colonial grid as scorched timber and open sky for the second time in a decade. What rose from those ashes was not nostalgia. It was calculation. And the people doing the calculating were not who you might expect, not French architects drawing from Parisian models, not Spanish colonial administrators working from official plans. They were refugees, they were free people of color, they were enslaved craftsmen working without the right to own what their hands were building. What they built together was one of the most climate-intelligent house types in American history, and its story has almost never been told honestly. The cottages that began appearing in the French Quarter and the new faubourgs after 1794 were the product of hard, expensive experience. Builders turned to brick, to stucco, to cypress. They made walls thicker. They kept roof lines low against the wind. They set structures close to the property line, reducing the gaps where fire could travel between buildings. Every decision carried a cost. Every cost had a lesson behind it. But the fires explain only the materials. They do not explain the shape. The form that emerged, 1 or 1.5 stories, a roof ridge running parallel to the street, a wide 4-bay facade opening almost directly onto the sidewalk, 4 massed rooms arranged 2 by 2 with no hallway inside, did not come from France or from Spain or from any single origin that history can pin cleanly on a map. It came from the Gulf, from the Caribbean, from people who had already lived, in places that tried to kill them with heat and rain and storm surge and had already worked out answers. The most direct channel for those answers was Saint-Domingue. What is now Haiti was, in the late 18th century, one of the wealthiest colonies in the Atlantic world, producing more sugar and coffee than almost anywhere else, and housing a population of enslaved Africans, free people of color, and French colonists who had developed their own creolized building culture over generations. When the Haitian Revolution began in 1791 and the colonial world of Saint-Domingue started to collapse, refugees moved in waves toward the Gulf Coast. They carried building knowledge already calibrated to heat, humidity, and tropical storm patterns, compact forms, deep overhangs, rooms that breathed, plans that wasted nothing. By 1810, New Orleans had received tens of thousands of Saint-Domingue refugees, many passing first through Cuba before being expelled northward. The city they arrived in was still rebuilding. The building traditions they brought fit what the city needed almost exactly. This is why the Creole cottage cannot be understood as a purely local invention. It was a convergence, French colonial structure meeting Caribbean climate logic, filtered through the specific pressures of a Gulf port city that was too hot, too flood-prone, too dense, and too scarred by fire to build the way its European inheritance would have dictated. The lots in the newly subdivided faubourgs, neighborhoods carved from old plantation lands just outside the original city, were narrow, often no more than 30 to 35 feet wide. Streets were close together. Building conventions pushed structures toward the property line rather than set behind gardens. The cottage answered all of these constraints at once, wide enough to fill a modest lot, low enough to resist wind, compact enough to be affordable for developers building rental rows, and porous enough, with aligned doorways and windows that caught the river breeze, to remain habitable in a climate where a sealed room in August felt like the inside of a held breath. By the 1820s, the form had stabilized across the quarter and the Faubourg Marignan, 4 roughly equal rooms around a central chimney stack, small service cabinets tucked into the rear corners, a steep gabled roof whose ridge ran left to right, an overhang at the eave line, the abat vent, extending 3 to 4 feet past the facade wall, throwing shade onto the brickwork and deflecting rain off the threshold. It was not a grand house, it was not trying to be, it was trying to survive. And for the people it was being built for, French Creoles, Haitian refugees, free people of color, small merchants and artisans who wanted permanence without plantation-scale display. Survival was exactly the right ambition. What they built was not just a house type, it was an argument about how to live in a place the climate had never made easy, made by people whose own presence in that place had never been guaranteed. Stand on any block in the French Quarter or the Faubourg Marigny and look at the cottages still standing there. Before you read the history, before you know the names of the families who lived inside, the building itself is already telling you something, not about charm, not about picturesque New Orleans streetscapes. About physics. The roof ridge runs left to right, parallel to the street, not perpendicular to it. This single decision separates a Creole cottage from almost every other small house type of its era, and it is not an aesthetic choice, it is a structural one. A roof oriented this way presents its widest, lowest profile to the prevailing winds coming off the Gulf, reducing the surface area a storm can catch, shedding rain efficiently to both sides, keeping the building's center of gravity low. In a city that hurricanes visited with regularity, this was not a detail. It was the difference between a house that stood and one that did not. The Abbot Vent, that deep overhang you can see from the street, was doing 3 things at once: throwing shade across the facade for most of the day, deflecting rain away from the threshold, and creating just enough covered margin at the sidewalk edge to leave a shutter open during a downpour without flooding the interior. Every inch of it was doing calculated work. The facade itself presents 4 bays to the street, 4 openings, usually a combination of doors and tall French windows fitted with wooden shutters. In many cottages, all 4 open directly to the sidewalk with no raised stoop between them or with only the shallowest threshold step. This is not informality. It is ventilation strategy. When all 4 bays are open, the house becomes a channel. River air moves through the facade, crosses the interior rooms, and exits through the rear. In a city without mechanical cooling, this cross breeze was the only relief available during the months when the air outside felt like warm, wet cloth pressed against the skin. Step inside, and the logic continues, though it takes a moment to recognize because it contradicts almost everything the Anglo-American house-type trained people to expect. There is no hallway. An Anglo-American visitor stepping into a Creole cottage for the first time in 1830 would have found this deeply disorienting. In the Greek revival houses going up across the American South at that same moment, the hallway was a moral instrument as much as an architectural one. It controlled access, organized hierarchy, allowed guests to be received without penetrating the family's private quarters. Privacy was built into the walls. The Creole cottage rejected all of that. 4 rooms arranged 2 by 2, doorways aligned straight through from front to back. To move from one room to another, you pass through the rooms themselves. There is no neutral corridor, no buffer between public and private. The aligned doorways, called en enfilade, meant that when front and rear were open simultaneously, the breeze moved in a straight line from street to yard. The house breathed as a single volume. Privacy was managed by convention, by furniture arrangement by which doors were closed at which hours, not by architectural subdivision. At the center of the plan, back-to-back fireplaces share a single chimney stack. 2 rooms, 1 flue, heat retained inside the building rather than radiating outward into the yard. In the rear corners sit the cabinets, small utility rooms tucking. The stair, the storage, and the unglamorous necessities into corners so that the 4 primary rooms remain as open and usable as possible. Nothing in this plan is wasted. Nothing is decorative that is not also structural. Behind the main structure, separated by a yard or connected by a side passage, behind the main structure, the real infrastructure of daily life was deliberately concentrated out of sight, a rear yard designed to be invisible from the street and arranged to stay that way. The entire rear yard was a working infrastructure, functional, essential, and structurally excluded from the household's public face. The materials the cottage was built from were chosen by the same logic. Cypress, cut from regional swamps and available in quantity along the river trade routes, was used for framing, shutters, floors, and woodwork because it resisted rot and termites in ways that other local timbers could not. Brick, fired at local kilns and used in the brick-between-post construction method inherited from French colonial practice. Structural timber posts with brick fill between them provided thermal mass that absorbed daytime heat and released it slowly after dark, moderating interior temperature swings. Low brick piers lifted the floor above the damp soil. New Orleans sits at or below sea level across much of its area, and groundwater was never far from the surface. Raising the floor even 12 or 18 inches reduced moisture intrusion, improved airflow beneath the structure, and provided a small buffer against the flooding that was not an occasional disaster in this city, but a recurring feature of life. Every element of the Creole cottage, read in sequence, reveals the same underlying priority: keep the air moving, keep the water out, keep the heat from accumulating, keep the structure standing when the storms arrive. It is a building type that never confused beauty with purpose. The beauty, where it exists, is a consequence of problems solved well. What the cottage looked like was the result of what it had to do. Every house type has a mythology about who it belongs to. The Creole cottage's mythology is pastel-colored and pleasantly vague. A charming old New Orleans house, French in spirit, warmly communal, somehow belonging to everyone who has ever loved the city. The actual history of who owned these buildings, who was permitted to own them, and who was systematically prevented from doing so is considerably less comfortable, and considerably more interesting. The earliest wave of cottage construction in the French Quarter and the new faubourgs was driven by people with capital and reasons to deploy it quickly. French Creoles who had accumulated wealth through the sugar and cotton economy, merchants connected to the river trade, speculators who understood that a rapidly growing port city needed housing faster than any single builder could supply it. These were the people commissioning rows of identical cottages on newly subdivided lots carved from old plantation lands just outside the original city boundary. The cottage's compact footprint and repeatable plan made it ideal for this kind of investment. A builder could erect 4 or 5 nearly identical structures on adjacent lots in the Faubourg Marigny, rent them to artisans or small shopkeepers, and collect steady income without maintaining a single large property. The visual coherence of those streetscapes today was not the result of neighborhood planning. It was the result of one owner building cheaply and consistently across a block. But alongside this speculative market, a different kind of ownership was taking shape. One that the standard history of American real estate almost never makes room for. Free people of color in New Orleans occupied a social position with no real parallel elsewhere in the antebellum South. They were not enslaved. They were not white. They existed within a 3-tiered racial system inherited from French and Spanish colonial law that permitted, under specific conditions, people of African descent who were legally free to own property, conduct business, and in some cases accumulate significant wealth. In the neighborhoods where Creole cottages were most dense, the Treme, the Faubourg Marigny, parts of the quarter itself, free people of color formed a substantial share of property owners. Some were skilled artisans, carpenters, plasterers, iron workers, masons who had built these cottages and then, through years of saved wages and informal credit arrangements, managed to purchase one. Others operated small businesses from cottages where the front room functioned as a shop and the rear rooms as living quarters. A spatial arrangement the four-bay plan accommodated almost perfectly. Time equals, quote, 1.0 seconds, quote, / greater than. This window of Black property ownership in antebellum New Orleans was real and documented. It was also narrow, contingent, and under constant legal pressure. The same decades that saw free people of color purchasing Creole cottages also saw the Louisiana legislature progressively tightening restrictions on free Black life, limiting movement, limiting assembly, limiting the ability to bring suit. By the 1850s, there were measures pushing to force free people of color to either leave the state or choose enslavement. The cottages some of these families owned were islands of material stability inside a legal system that was actively working to eliminate the conditions that had made that stability possible. For the white Creole middle class, the cottage communicated something different but equally specific. It was not a mansion, and it was not trying to be. The plantation house, with its columns, its symmetrical grandeur, its deliberate announcement of landed wealth, was a different architectural language entirely, one that spoke of cotton fields and enslaved hundreds and the kind of power that needed a portico to frame it properly. The cottage said something quieter. It said, "We are here, we are permanent, we are not going anywhere, and we have enough." For artisans, small merchants, and skilled tradesmen who had built their lives in the dense street life of Creole New Orleans rather than on agricultural land, this was exactly the right register. Modest without being poor, ordered without being grand, Catholic and Francophone and recognizably not Anglo-American, in a city where the Anglo-American presence upriver was growing every decade and bringing with it different values, different building forms, and a different idea of what a respectable house should look like. The Haitian refugees who arrived between the 1790s and 1810 brought their own relationship to this building type. Many came with specific skills in construction, in domestic trades, in the organizational knowledge of managing Caribbean properties that translated directly into the New Orleans building economy. Some arrived with capital and moved quickly into the property market of a city expanding fast enough to absorb new owners. Others arrived with almost nothing and entered the rental market at its lowest tier, occupying single rooms within cottages or cramped quarters in rear dependencies. The Haitian migration did not produce a single class of resident. It produced a spectrum, and that spectrum occupied the cottage at every level. Which brings us to who was left out entirely. The enslaved population of New Orleans had no access to property ownership, no legal standing as buyers or tenants, and no architectural presence that the historical record was structured to preserve. They appear in the cottage's story not as owners or recognized residents, but as builders who never held the deed to anything they constructed, as domestic workers who spent their days in the detached kitchens and rear yards that the cottage's plan deliberately kept out of the street-facing picture, and as people who sometimes lived in the dependencies behind these houses in conditions that the word quarters sanitizes almost beyond recognition. The cottage was built in significant part by people who could not legally own one. The mythology of the Creole cottage, charming, communal, everyone's New Orleans, papers over a property history that was intensely contested, racially stratified, and shaped at every level by who the law permitted to own something and who it did not. The pastel facades were real, so was everything behind them. Before dawn, in the detached kitchen at the rear of a Creole cottage lot, the day had already started. Fire built, water, hauled. The first meal underway while the front rooms were still dark and quiet. The person doing this work does not appear in the property records, the tax documents, or the architectural histories. But she is the reason the household functioned at all. The detached kitchen was not an architectural flourish. It was not a charming feature that later owners would convert into a guest suite and photograph for real estate listings. It was a workplace, hot, smoke-filled, dangerous, and staffed almost entirely by people whose names have been written out of the story of what the Creole cottage is and what it meant. Start with the building itself, before anyone lived in it. The construction of a Creole cottage in antebellum New Orleans drew on a skilled labor force that was, to a degree almost impossible to overstate today, black. Enslaved and free black craftsmen dominated the building trades of the city throughout the period when most of these structures were erected. Bricklayers, carpenters, plasterers, ironworkers, roofers, these were not peripheral roles in the construction process. They were the construction process. The brick between post walls that defined the structural system of the cottage were laid by enslaved masons or free black tradesmen who had learned their craft through apprenticeships that the white Creole building economy depended on entirely while acknowledging almost not at all. The cypress framing was cut and fitted by carpenters working in conditions that varied from relatively skilled and sometimes compensated, in the case of hired-out enslaved men whose wages went to their enslavers, to brutally coerced. The plastered finishes, the wooden shutters, the iron hardware, all of it produced by hands that would never hold the deed to the structure those hands had made. This was not incidental. The New Orleans building economy in Chateauitier, the early 19th century, was structured around the skilled labor of enslaved and free black craftsmen in a way that made the city's rapid physical expansion possible. Without that labor, the rows of Creole cottages that filled the French Quarter and the faubourgs in the 1820s and 1830s could not have been built at the speed or cost that made them viable as speculative investments. The low build cost that made the cottage attractive to developers was not simply a product of compact design and repeatable plans. It was a product of labor extracted at below market or no market rates from people who had no power to negotiate otherwise. Once the building was complete and the household moved in, a different category of labor began. No less invisible, no less essential, and no less racialized than what had come before. The detached kitchen was the center of domestic life in a way that the street-facing facade never was. The person doing this work was almost always enslaved, or, in households that could not afford to purchase a person outright, a hired black domestic worker whose wages were determined by someone other than herself. Cooking in a New Orleans summer in an open-fire kitchen was not a domestic task in any gentle sense of that phrase. Temperatures inside the kitchen building regularly exceeded anything the main house experienced, even in August, even at midday. Burns were common. Fire was a constant hazard. The work was physically exhausting. Heavy cast iron, open flames, no ventilation beyond whatever gaps existed in the structure, no respite between the preparation of one meal and the beginning of the next. And the work did not stop at cooking. The same person or the same small group of people was responsible for hauling water for drinking and washing, maintaining the cistern, doing the laundry in large tubs that required hours of boiling and scrubbing and wringing, cleaning the main house rooms, emptying the privy, carrying waste, managing the yard. The domestic economy of the cottage ran entirely on this labor. Without it, the orderly, climate-adapted, modestly respectable life that the cottage facade projected was not possible for a single day. The spatial arrangement of the cottage enshrined this division in architectural form. The side alley, the narrow passage running along the property line between the main house and the lot boundary, was the route through which domestic workers moved from the street to the rear yard without entering the front rooms. Deliveries came through the side passage. Workers came and went through the side passage. The visual logic of the street facade, with its 4 ordered bays facing the neighborhood, was maintained precisely because everything that complicated that image was routed around it. What the street saw was the household's presentable front. What happened in the rear yard, the kitchen, the alley, and the dependency buildings was structurally excluded from that picture. The upper rooms of the dependency were not guest accommodations. They were worker housing, small, minimally finished, accessible only by an exterior stair, positioned as far from the street-facing rooms as the lot allowed. The people who slept in them were the people whose labor made the rest of the property function, and the architecture made sure their presence remained behind the threshold of what the household presented publicly. Free people of color who worked as skilled tradesmen occupied a slightly different position in this economy, though not an entirely comfortable one. A free black carpenter or plasterer working in New Orleans in the 1830s might earn wages, might accumulate savings, might even own property, but he operated within a system that was simultaneously dependent on his skill and structured to prevent that skill from translating into social equality. The building trades offered one of the few paths through which free black men in antebellum Louisiana could build something resembling economic stability. That path was real. It was also narrow, contingent on the continuation of a legal status that the state government spent several decades trying to eliminate. The overhang shades the facade, the aligned doorways catch the breeze, the detached kitchen keeps the heat outside, and the side alley keeps the people doing the work out of the picture. The Creole cottage has never been an innocent object. Look at that 4-room plan one more time. No hallway, 4 equal rooms, every wall a potential partition. It looks like a climate solution. It was also something else entirely. It was a financial instrument. From its earliest iterations, the cottage was designed to generate returns. The compact footprint, the repeatable plan, the standardized construction details that allowed a builder to erect 4 or 5 nearly identical structures in quick succession on adjacent lots, none of this emerged from a purely domestic logic. It emerged from the logic of investment, of rental income, of a rapidly expanding port city where demand for housing consistently outpaced supply and where a modest, well-placed structure on a 30-foot lot could pay for itself many times over if managed correctly. The capital that built most Creole cottages in the peak decades of the 1820s through the 1850s came primarily from the plantation and mercantile economy of the Gulf South. Sugar and cotton generated wealth at a scale that dwarfed anything the urban building trades could produce on their own, and that wealth moved into New Orleans real estate with regularity. A planter with seasonal cash surpluses, a merchant with profits from river trade, a lawyer or physician with income built on plantation business, these were the people with both the capital to commission new construction and the financial sophistication to understand that urban rental property in a growing city was a reliable store of value. They were not building cottages to live in. They were building them to own. The typical transaction looked something like this. A speculative developer purchases a block of newly subdivided lots in the Faubourg Marigny or the Bywater. He commissions a builder to erect a row of 4 or 5 cottages to a standard plan. He immediately begins renting them to artisans, shopkeepers, and working-class families who cannot afford to buy but need permanent urban housing. The rental income covers the construction debt. The property appreciates as the neighborhood fills in around it. The developer never lives anywhere near the cottages he owns. 4 roughly equal rooms, each capable of being used independently, gave an owner extraordinary flexibility in how the property was deployed. A household that needed all 4 rooms could occupy them that way. A household under financial pressure could rent 1 or 2 rooms to a boarder, bringing in supplemental income while retaining the rest of the house. A shopkeeper could convert the 2 front rooms into commercial space opening onto the street and live in the rear rooms behind the business. A landlord wanting to maximize yield from a single structure could subdivide it into multiple small tenancies, each paying separately. The same building supported all of these configurations without requiring structural modification. The rear dependency extended this financial logic to the back of the lot. A 2-story outbuilding with ground floor storage and upper floor sleeping rooms could generate its own rental income entirely separately from the main cottage. In some cases, the yi Dependency was rented to free black residents, who occupied the upper floor while a white or Creole family rented the main house on the street side. In other cases, the dependency housed enslaved domestic workers whose labor was hired out to the cottage tenant as part of the rental arrangement. The owner of the person receiving wages that the tenant paid, the tenant receiving domestic service they could not otherwise afford, and the person whose labor was being monetized having no say in any of it. The dependency was not just a kitchen and a storage room. It was a second revenue stream, and it ran on the same racial economy as everything else in the city. For free people of color, the path to cottage ownership looked very different. The paths that existed were informal, precarious, and dependent on personal relationships that could dissolve without legal remedy. Formal banking was effectively closed to them. A free black artisan might save wages over many years and purchase a cottage lot outright rather than borrowing against it. A free woman of color might receive property through a notarial act from a white partner, a transfer that was legal under Louisiana's civil law system but vulnerable to challenge by the man's white heirs after his death. Some free people of color formed informal credit partnerships with others in their community, pooling resources to purchase property that no individual could have afforded alone. None of these paths were easy. All of them were more fragile than the financing available to white buyers. And even for those who managed to buy, the climate did not stop extracting cost. New Orleans was not a forgiving environment for buildings. Rot, termite damage, storm deterioration were constants rather than occasional problems. A cottage owner was never more than a few hurricane seasons from a repair bill that could threaten the ownership itself. For a free black artisan who had spent 15 years saving to purchase a single cottage. One bad year could undo everything. After the Civil War, the financial logic of the cottage began to shift in ways that accelerated its transformation from everyday housing into something else. Population growth, new immigration patterns, and the expansion of the city toward new neighborhoods made the old faubourg cottages less desirable to buyers who could afford newer construction elsewhere. Landlords who retained these properties responded by subdividing them further, adding interior partitions, attaching lean-to additions at the rear, converting dependencies into additional sleeping rooms, maximizing yield from structures that were now aging and increasingly occupied by the city's poorest residents. The cottage that had once signaled modest respectability now signaled something closer to affordable last resort. By the late 20th century, the financial narrative had reversed completely. Preservation designation, tourism economies, and the cultural branding of historic New Orleans neighborhoods transformed these same structures into high-value real estate. A cottage that a landlord had subdivided into 4 cramped rental units in 1940 was now a candidate for luxury renovation and short-term rental listing at rates that no working-class family could approach. The building had not changed. The money had. The Creole cottage did not disappear dramatically. It did not burn in a single fire or fall in a single storm. What destroyed it, or rather, what destroyed the world inside it, was something slower, harder to photograph, and more deliberate than any hurricane. It was worn down across generations by economic pressures, demographic shifts, policy decisions, and a preservation politics that protected buildings while quietly abandoning the people those buildings had been built to shelter. The first pressure came from within the city's own growth logic. By the 1870s, the shotgun house, narrower, cheaper, faster to build on the city's new lots, had replaced the cottage as the default small house type. The cottage stopped being built. What remained was an aging stock of structures whose owners faced a simple choice: expensive maintenance or profitable subdivision. Most chose subdivision. Landlords carved interior partitions into rooms that had been designed to breathe as open, connected spaces. They attached lean-to additions at the rear, squeezing additional rentable square footage onto lots the original builders had calibrated carefully. They converted detached kitchens into sleeping quarters and rented the yard itself to families who built improvised structures against the back fence. The cottages that had once housed single households of modest means now housed multiple. Families in conditions the buildings were never designed to support: overcrowded, poorly ventilated, under-maintained, and increasingly associated in the public imagination with poverty rather than the modest respectability they had once projected. Then came the 20th century and the machinery of urban renewal. The Federal Housing Act of 1949 and the highway construction programs of the 1950s and 1960s gave city governments tools for demolition at a scale that no fire or storm had managed. In New Orleans, these programs fell with particular force on the Black neighborhoods where Creole cottages were most concentrated. The Treme, one of the oldest Black neighborhoods in the country, where free people of color had owned property since the early 19th century, lost a substantial portion of its built fabric to the construction of Louis Armstrong Park. On North Rampart Street alone, blocks of Creole cottages that had stood since the 1820s were cleared in a matter of months. The displaced residents were not offered equivalent housing. They were simply displaced, scattered into public housing projects or into other neighborhoods that were themselves already under pressure. The elevated expressway built along the riverfront in the 1960s severed connections between neighborhoods and erased additional blocks of historic housing. The buildings that were demolished were not evaluated for their architectural or historical significance before the wrecking crews arrived. Meanwhile, in the neighborhoods the tourism economy had identified as marketable, the French Quarter above all, and later the Faubourg Marigny, a different kind of pressure was accumulating. Preservation campaigns that began in earnest in the 1930s and 1940s succeeded in establishing historic district protections that prevented demolition and regulated alterations. These protections saved buildings. They also, over time, converted neighborhoods into commodities. The French Quarter, by the late 20th century, was no longer primarily a residential neighborhood in any ordinary sense. It was a destination, and the cottages within it were assets valued for their photogenic facades and their capacity to generate short-term rental income rather than for their role in housing the city's working population. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 exposed every fault line in this history simultaneously. The storm's flooding was not random. It followed the geography of race and class with brutal precision, hitting hardest in the lower-income Black neighborhoods while leaving the higher-ground tourist districts relatively intact. Cottages in the 9th Ward and other flooded areas sat waterlogged for weeks. Many owners, facing insurance disputes, federal bureaucracy, and repair costs that exceeded their resources, simply walked away. The properties were acquired by investors, demolished, or left to deteriorate. The rebuilt neighborhoods that emerged bore little resemblance to what had existed before. What Katrina accelerated, the short-term rental economy finished. Platforms that allowed individual property owners to rent by the night transformed the calculus of cottage ownership across the historic neighborhoods. A cottage that generated modest long-term rental income could generate several times that amount as a vacation rental, which meant that every long-term tenant was now a financial liability compared to what the property could earn empty and available to tourists. Evictions followed. Neighborhoods that had maintained some degree of residential continuity through decades of pressure began losing permanent residents at rates that community organizations struggled to document fast enough to contest. The long goodbye of the Creole cottage is not a story of architectural failure. The buildings that survived were well-built, climate-intelligent, and adaptable. What failed around them was the social and economic infrastructure that had made them homes rather than assets, the web of ownership, tenancy, community, and continuity that gave the architecture its meaning beyond the facade. The cottage endured, the world it was built for did not. The Creole cottage is having a second life. Not as housing, not in any sense that would have been recognizable to the people who built it or lived in it, but as an idea, a symbol, a reference point in arguments about climate, authenticity, affordability, and what cities owe to their own history. The climate argument arrives first, and it is the most straightforward. In an era of rising temperatures, intensifying storms, and growing discomfort with the energy consumption of mechanically cooled buildings, the cottage's passive strategies look less like pre-modern limitation and more like forgotten intelligence. Deep roof overhangs that shade masonry walls, aligned openings that move air through a structure without a compressor running, compact footprints that minimize the volume requiring cooling, raised foundations that acknowledge, rather than deny, the reality of water. These are not quaint features of an old building. They are engineering responses to a climate that is now, after a century of denial, being taken seriously again. The cottage solved problems in 1830 that contemporary architects are being paid significant sums to rediscover. But the climate argument, taken alone, is too comfortable. It allows the cottage to be admired as a technical achievement while setting aside the human history that produced it. A passive cooling system built on the labor of enslaved craftsmen and maintained by enslaved domestic workers is not simply a lesson in sustainable design. It is a lesson in who paid for, the comfort that the design delivered, and who did not get to enjoy it. The preservation argument carries the same tension. Historic district protections in the French Quarter, the Marigny, and parts of the Treme have kept facades intact that demolition pressure would otherwise have erased. This is a genuine achievement and a genuine loss simultaneously. The facades survive. The communities that built and inhabited them have been substantially displaced by tourism economies, by short-term rental platforms, by the appreciation in property values that historic designation itself accelerates. Preservation, as it has been practiced in New Orleans, has protected buildings more reliably than it has protected people. The cottage stands. The family that lived in it for 3 generations does not. The housing argument is perhaps the most urgent. American cities are in the middle of a housing shortage whose causes are multiple and whose solutions remain politically contested. One of the recurring proposals is a return to smaller, denser, more walkable urban housing, the kind of compact, street-facing residential fabric that the Creole cottage faubourgs represented before zoning codes, parking requirements, and minimum lot sizes made them effectively illegal to replicate. The cottage is being invoked as evidence that this kind of urbanism worked, that it produced livable, resilient, culturally rich neighborhoods at a scale that contemporary cities are struggling to rebuild. What the cottage means now depends entirely on who is doing the meaning-making. For the tourism industry, it means atmosphere. For the preservation community, it means fabric. For climate advocates, it means precedent. For the descendants of the free Black families who owned and built these structures, it means patrimony, a material inheritance that the city's economics have made increasingly difficult to hold on to. The building outlasted the world that made it. That is not a comfortable fact. It is not a triumphant one. It is simply what remains when a city preserves its architecture more carefully than it preserves the people that architecture was built to shelter. When the facade is protected and the community behind it is allowed to dissolve quietly over decades until what is left is the image of a place rather than the place itself. The cottage is still standing on those narrow lots in the Marigny, in the Treme, in the Quarter. Its overhang still throws shade onto the sidewalk. Its aligned doorways still catch whatever breeze comes off the river. It is still, in every physical sense, exactly what it was built to be. What it no longer is is home to the people who built it. That is the history the facade does not tell, and that is the history worth remembering.